Vishy Anand has not beaten Magnus Carlsen in almost 5 years, so this game was really sweet for him. He's on a great run of form right now, coming off the back of the Superbet Rapid and Blitz. This is Norway Chess Blitz. Now it's day one of the classical tournament. Here the players were playing to see which colours they'd get most of, more whites, more blacks. And then they're going into the classical tournament starting today on Tuesday 31st of May. So I'll be covering the classical games from this tournament, but first I'm looking at this blitz one. Vishy kicked off here with pawn to e4. Now Magnus goes g6, the so-called modern defence, pawn d4 from Vishy, and now you can go knight f6 here. I mention this because Magnus has played a lot of this stuff in online blitz. This is known as the Norwegian rat. After pawn e5, knight into h5, bishop e2. Now you go d6, you give this knight. Crazy stuff. Check out Magnus's banter blitz if you want to see this stuff. Really fun games that he plays here. So he loves to dabble with these systems. Now he doesn't bring the knight to f6 here. He goes d6 instead. The classic move, covering the e5 break. And now knight c3 from Vishy. He starts developing pieces, just saying, okay, 2 pawns in the centre is enough for me for now. And this is the main way to play. And now Magnus goes bishop g7. And this is really the key difference here between the modern defence, which Magnus is playing here, and the Pirc defence, which starts with the knight f6 stuff before bishop g7. The Pirc defence, by the way, is spelt P-I-R-C. I was saying it wrong for years, but I believe that's how you're supposed to say it. So this is the modern, bishop g7. Vishy goes bishop to e3, and now pawn a6 from Magnus. He wants b5, then b4 potentially, kicking that knight, undermining e4, and Vishy for his part is preparing queen d2 and castles queenside, aggressive setup. And queen d2 is the main move here, but Vishy actually starts with h4. We see that so often these days in modern elite chess. They love chucking that h-pawn. So after h4, now Magnus goes knight to f6. When you push h4, you weaken g4, of course. There's no h3. So now that knight's looking to hop into g4 if allowed. That's how you would meet pawn e5, for example, with a good game for black. So pawn f3 covers that square. Now b5 from Magnus. Queen d2 from Vishy. And now Magnus decides he doesn't want this bishop to just set up camp on h6, squash in his position, then g4, h5 later. So he goes h5 immediately. Can be double-edged because now you give white something to bite on with g4, but he hasn't yet castled, so it's an okay move here. Now this knight came to h3, and I should just say, by the way, castles might have been a bit more precise there, because after knight h3, that one would love to hop back to f2 and then support g4, and that's why Magnus just chops it off straight away, trying to slow down white's aggressive plan of playing g4. So the rook now recaptured, and here knight beats d7 was played by Magnus. g4's not working here, the square's well covered. Vishy now castles, and queen c8 from Magnus. A nice sidestep, preparing c5 here, leaving the rook on a8 to maybe come to the b file later or support those pawns moving down the board. King b1 now from Vishy. Always play king b1, as Ben Feingold would say. Now pawn c5. And here Vishy has many different moves. You know, he could go bishop to e2, for example, just developing. But then Magnus has tons of options. b4, c4, takes here. And it's just a lot to calculate when you're in blitz chess. So Vishy just takes on c5. Good practical decision. Clarify the pawn structure. White's still better here. Got the space in the centre and the bishop pair. But Vishy misses a really nice shot here. A very thematic move. Always look out for this one. Pawn to e5. And this is actually really strong here in connection with the g4 ideas. So if black captures that one, kind of a forced move, well then you can go pawn to g4. Now it looks like you're just losing a pawn, but no matter how black takes, this knight on c5 is a problem. So if you take with the queen, well that's the easy one, you lose your knight. And if you take with the knight, well then once again we chop here, we decoy the queen away from this square, Then we hop in with check, and this is actually leading to mate on the back rank. Really nice position when black hasn't castled the king. So pawn e5 was a nice shot there, but Vishy missed it. He could have gone for actually a number of different moves to keep advantage here. So bishop d4, knight d5, bishop e2, any of those standard looking moves. But he goes knight to e2 here, and it's just not quite as precise, kind of going in the wrong direction. Now Magnus castles, good move. You can't get the g4 stuff in anymore so comfortably. And Vishy now goes bishop h6, looking to remove that defender of the king. And Magnus here goes wrong. So he should go something like rook to d8, and then just slow play the position, rook b8 to start pushing those pawns, maybe come knight e6 soon, challenge the knight if it ever comes to d4, just get his pieces into the game. But what Magnus does here is pawn a5, pushing those pawns aggressively, but now he's weakened this one. And if Vishy had found knight d4, this would have been a great move. Because say you defend that pawn with pawn b4, for example, well, can you find the move here that leaves white with a devastating attack on the king side? And if you're enjoying this video, do hit that like button and let me know, and consider subscribing to the channel to never miss a future video. So the move for white here is knight to f5. You're just ripping open that g file if that one's captured, and it's hard to see what else to do. And then you don't go queen to g5 here, because then you're running into knight e6. You defend the g7 square and pick up a tempo on the queen, but instead the move here is rook to g3. And now there's pressure here. If you defend like this, we just take the pawn, kick away the defender. If you defend like this, well, now we can actually crash through. The knight recaptures, then queen h6, and you can't defend that knight. Knight e6 takes on f5. Just none of the tactics are actually working for black. White is crashing through here. So that was a devastating shot, which Vishy could have played, but he missed this one, unfortunately. This is blitz chess, of course. Instead, he just took on g7. The king recaptured, and now he went rook to g3. But this time the file's not open, and it actually sets up a tactical shot for Magnus now, as we'll see. So he first pushes pawn b4. Now Vishy goes knight to d4. He's looking at some of this check stuff using the pin here. But now Magnus comes up with a really nice counter shot. He takes on e4 here. The pawn recaptures, knight takes, and he's giving his two minor pieces for a rook and two pawns here. Sometimes that can be dubious, but in this position here, black has such a big presence in the centre with those pawns that these minor pieces are actually really struggling to find outposts. So this is a good practical decision. The computer gives it level, but much easier to play for black here. So Magnus goes queen g4. He's happy to exchange queens if Vishy will let him. Again, that big rolling pawn blockade will be really challenging for the minor pieces. So Vishy drops back, covers his rook, which was also attacked. Magnus brings a rook to the c file, and now Vishy wants to develop with bishop to e2, but then his g2 pawn would be hanging. So he goes g3 to defend that one. Now this rook activated to c5, bishop e2 hit the queen, queen e4, and now queen d2 defended that c2 point, overprotected it. He doesn't want to get mated, and now rook e5 from Magnus. He activates down the e-file, pressuring this bishop. Very double-edged game now. The bishop came to f3, hits the queen. It dropped into e3 here. Again, Magnus offers the exchange. Vishy ducks it with queen to g2. And now Magnus should go rook to c8 here, just bringing another piece into the game, coming to that c-file. Instead, he goes a4, but this is more ambitious. This pawn's now loose. So's this pawn if the heavy piece is ever moved, and Vishy immediately goes knight c6, hits those pawns, hits this rook here. It came into f5, pressuring the bishop, but a nice defense from Vishy. He just slides the rook up the board, hits the queen, and this is actually a draw offer, because after Magnus checks, we see this repetition here, but Magnus is having none of it. So in this position here, he doesn't check again. He comes over to c5, and now Vishy can take on e7. It's all getting very double-edged now. The position is still roughly level, but so hard to play in blitz for both players here. So the rook is hit, it comes into e5, hits that knight, it finds this beautiful post on d5, blockading that d-pawn, and now rook e1 check from Magnus. Vishy hops back with the bishop this time, wants to leave his rook activated. So Magnus activates his rook, brings it to that e-file, and Vishy now makes a blunder, but it's a really hard one to see. So he goes queen to d2 here, leaves the protection of the g1 square, pressures this pawn, and Magnus had an amazing counter shot here with queen to g1. You're now threatening to take this bishop and then bring the other rook down to pin the queen, and there's just no defense against it, amazingly. I mean, say king c1, will you just take here, queen takes, rook e1. I mean, have a pause, have a look yourself. There's just nothing that white can actually do. So that queen g1 move would have been very powerful, but Magnus missed it. He was focused on the queen side, same as Vishy, so he pushes a3, looking to create some counterplay against the king. Vishy snapped off here, and Magnus should actually take this queen here. Again, very hard to see this stuff, impossible in blitz chess, but after the knight captures, now there's this amazing rook 8 to e3 move, and the whole idea is that the rook can't take here or here, because then we're actually taking on d1 with checkmate. And if instead you try and take the pawn like this, well, you've still got a problem. We capture the rook, knight takes, then you pick up the bishop. It's just not good for white tactically. So you'd have to do something like takes on d6, carry on holding the bishop. Black can then take here, and the whole position's just getting kind of crazy. Black might now actually be able to dream of some counterplay with these pawns later. But okay, Magnus didn't see this. Very tough to see that one. Instead, he activated the rook anyway. Now the queen took here, the pawn recaptured, and Vishy picks up on a3. This pawn is now really dangerous now as an outside passer. So c4 from Magnus, the rook has to stay on the d file, protect the bishop. So it drops back to d2 here, rook g1, comes behind the pawn, maybe prepares to double. Knight c3 now from Vishy, he hits that rook, it drops back to e6 here, and pawn a4. That pawn gets going. Magnus takes on g3, hits this knight. It hops into b5, and now Magnus's last chance here was pawn to c3. You just start to stir up a bit of trouble in the white position. There could be mating threats soon. Again, maybe you can get these pawns going, but not easy to see this one. Magnus instead goes rook to e4, attacking this one, looking for counterplay with his own pawns, but now pawn c3 from Vishy, and the pieces are beautifully coordinated. Everything holds each other. The bishop holds the pawn, the rook holds the bishop, and this one's just going to be running way too fast. So Magnus took on h4, pawn a5, rook h1, and here Magnus either lost on time or resigned, I'm not sure, but Vishy took the victory. So a brilliant game by Vishy, really good tense back and forth battle, but great fight by Magnus, not taking that draw. And this was the standings at the end of the day, some of the usual suspects, but here we can see Vishy also doing exceptionally well. Really exciting tournament to come. I'll be covering those games. If you want to see another amazing game between these two players, click here. Thanks for watching, see you soon.